Hello, am I me now?
Yes.
Yay.
You're so
Brilliant.
new. Congratulations.
It felt very odd, especially as she's gone into another room to knit. It's very difficult for her to do this.
I did consider experimenting with funky Zoom backgrounds, but I decided it probably wouldn't be professional.
Yeah, let's keep it strictly professional here, people.
That is a very starey owl in the background, Josh.
Oh, this is a character from one of my books. Not quite an owl, but very owl inspired. That's Skull.
Ooh, cool.
And it looks like we're live. Hey.
Oh.
Talk about Skull. We're gonna talk about genre. Hi everyone, welcome to QuaranCon2020, and this with a very scary owl. I'm not taking my own advice and muting the stream. Okay, there we go. Sorry for the technical hitches, folks. We are still there's a word for what we're doing. We'll call pantsing it. We're pantsing right now. So yes, I'm Josh Foreman. I'm your host for this particular panel, and it's about genre. And the reason I volunteered to host this panel is because this topic is fascinating to me. I write books that I usually describe as having science fiction bones, but fantasy skin. So anyone reading it will feel like they're reading fantasy, but under the surface, it's all hard sci-fi. So let's introduce our panel today. I'm just going to list their names. First names. You guys can fill in how you actually say your last names, and give a little bio, what you do, what your background is, what your, I don't know, favorite genres are that you work in. So we've got Dave, we've got RJ, Anita, and Adrian. Let us start with Dave.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I write under DP Walliscroft, but I am Dave. I am the author of epic fantasy books. My series of books is called The Wildfire Cycle. So I get to show my books. Here's Kingshold, then Tales of Kingshold, and Ioth, City of Lights. And a new book coming out on Tuesday called Tales of Ioth. And like I said, I typically write, I think of it as epic fantasy, but I'm really interested in this panel today as we talk about genre because I feel like there's various kind of, the epic is so broad, like how do you actually start to make it be a little bit more specific and helpful to readers? So nice to be here, Josh.
Excellent. Next we will go down to RJ.
Oh, hello. I'm RJ Barker, and everyone does call me RJ, and it's what's on my books, which handily just happened to be here. This is my first novel, which is Age of Assassins, and then Blood of Assassins, and then King of Assassins, and they're sort of fantasy murder mysteries, I suppose. Their genesis is very much in Agatha Christie and things like that, which I really love. And then my newest novel is The Bone Ships, which I've got the very fancy hardback here of.
Beautiful
which
cover
is
there.
It is beautiful, and even beautiful inside. It has a really lovely map. If I can find the map, done by Tom Parker, who I always end up plugging Tom because I'm a massive fan. And that's like a fantasy naval adventure. And I wouldn't really say that I write any particular. I mean, it's called epic fantasy because that's what my publisher wants to sell it as. But I thought that was murder mysteries, and my agent said, no, you write epic fantasy because that's what will sell. So I never really think about genre when I write. Interestingly, when you said about science fiction, somebody reviewed The Bone Ships and said RJ writes fantasy like a science fiction writer, which would make sense because I tend to read a lot more science fiction. And I don't explain anything; I just let you work it out.
Great. Yeah, that'll be a good topic for us to cover. Let's go to Anita.
Yeah, hi, I'm Anita, and I write under A.F. Stewart. I write horror and fantasy with a little poetry on the side, and this is my latest book. That's a horror fantasy mix. So yeah, and my genres tend to be dark, and I like to mix them up. So sometimes it's hard to just stick them in one place, but I try.
All right. Very cool. Next, we're going to go to Adrian.
Hello, I'm Adrian Tchaikovsky. I write a fairly wide variety of fantasy and science fiction. So I've done epic fantasy with my Shadows of the Apt, and I've done more smaller scale heroic fantasy. I'm probably best known for my science fiction these days, especially Children of Time and other, which is sort of the subgenre of spider science fiction, which I consider myself a major exponent of. And recently I've got, this is my most recent one out, or will be next month, Firewalkers, which is climate change science fiction. Just my shot at that fairly well riddled target.
Okay, 2 technical notes real quick. Adrian, can you turn your volume up just a little bit? And everyone who didn't see my show notes, please post a link to your work, and I'll paste that into the chat from time to time. Okay, so that's everyone, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're all covered. Great. So let's start with some perspectives on genre. So this is what I would love to hear people who work in lots of different genres talk about. So from my perspective, there's a marketing perspective, there's a consumer expectations perspective, and there's an artistic perspective. And we've already heard from your introductions, there's a wide range from you guys and how much you think about this stuff, how much you care about this stuff, but we all know that these have impacts on our work and how it's seen in the world. So anyone who has thoughts, raise your hand and I'll point to someone. Yes, RJ, you were first.
I'm very eager. Adrian will tell you that, because it's really weird. We're all around the world, and Adrian's there, and he's literally 10 minutes down the road from me, and it's really odd. But I'm a complete tart. I have no genre allegiance whatsoever. I would write anything as long as I can find a way into it that amuses me. And I kind of just think that genre is clothes for stories. That's all it is. And you're kind of, this happens to be the clothes these stories are wearing. And I don't really think of it past that as I can use those tools. Like with Age of Assassins, I wanted to write a murder mystery, but it needed magic, so it went into a fantasy world, and that worked because those tools of that genre helped me tell a story that interested me. But that's as far as I think about genre. In will it let me do what I want to do? Because I'm essentially incredibly selfish.
Very good. Anita, you were second.
Yeah, to me, genre is about expectations. I mean, if you're writing fantasy, there are certain expectations the readers want. And so as an author, you try and bring them to the table while still trying to put your own spin on it, as it were. And that's kind of, as from a writing point, that's what genre means to me. From a marketing standpoint, it's a total different animal that still confuses me.
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, it for me, it actually, I can't actually turn the gain on my mic up any further, so I'm just going to try speaking up.
Right.
It makes a big difference to me when I'm writing, to know what genre I'm writing in. And I think it's just because I have a fairly kind of compartmentalized mind. But even within the finer distinctions, when I'm writing what I would think of as a space opera, my approach to it is quite different to when I'm writing a sort of a hard SF book, more like Children of Time, just because there are different tools in your toolkit that are permissible. And even writing the different scale of writing a big epic fantasy compared to a more character scale heroic fantasy, it changes the approach. It changes the sort of way I would approach the planning, because I do plan. And I suspect this probably represents more of a mental limitation in me than an actual real thing in the genre, but it's very much an integral way of how I approach a project.
So you would say that the structure of the story is impacted greatly by the genre that you're working in.
Yeah, and I think this is going back to what Anita was saying, is there are expectations with any given genre. And even if you split the genres very finely, your audience will be expecting a certain thing. And even if you don't give it to them slavishly, you at least have to know what their expectations are.
Yeah. All right, Dave, what do you have to say?
Well, just to build on what everyone's saying, I mean, I just think that basically genre only exists as for those marketing reasons. It helps kind of readers identify things that they're potentially going to like, and then that's why, to Adrian's point and to Anita's point, it's important to understand what those expectations are. But really, kind of, I'm not quite sure that genre necessarily means anything to me when I sit down to write. I try to think about what story I want to do, and there's definitely themes that I want to bring in. My first book definitely had political fantasy elements, but it's not like a hardcore political fantasy or anything. But so really, it's just like it's a shorthand for our readers. We want to be able to kind of like make sure that people are getting targeted and matched up to the right kind of books, because they're more likely to enjoy it then. But otherwise, I think it's got very little meaning.
Do any of you have any stories of a time where you felt that your story would be best described in one genre, but was marketed another way, or you got advice to market it a different way?
I totally thought I'd written a crime novel with this. I totally did. Until my agent went, no, because we can't sell. Crime readers will not read a fantasy crime novel, but fantasy readers will love a fantasy crime novel. And it wasn't called Age of Assassins then either. It was called The Uncrowned Heir. And Orbit came back going, that's a bit crime novel-y. And I went, yes, it is. And I went, can you think of something that maybe isn't crime novel-y? And I went, oh, okay. Then and I went away and I came back with All Death's Well Intentioned, which I dearly, dearly loved. I thought was a lovely title for it. And they went, yeah, it's a beautiful title. It's a bit historic fiction. Can you come up with? And we spent about 2 months coming up with titles until eventually they turned around and went, look, we want something that has assassins in the title. I was like, right. And then when I got the cover for it, can you see that? I loved all this, and then I saw this person with the hood and the swords, and I was like, who's that? Because they're not in the book.
Good sign when you can't tell who's on your cover. Yeah.
and I just didn't get it, but that is a straight message to the reader saying assassins. That is all it is. He's not in the book. I always said the biggest mystery about these books is who that person is. And it took me a long time to come to terms with that, because I couldn't get my head around that thing, that this isn't, that in my head is not the book we wrote. But then you kind of realize that actually we lie to the reader to get them to read our books, because that's the way marketing works. Like with the Bone Ships, we have this beautiful dragon on the cover, and we mention the beautiful dragon in the blurb and everywhere. And when I talk about it, I mention the dragon. But when you read the book, it is clearly not a dragon. It's a kaiju. It's much more like Godzilla or something like that. It doesn't do dragon things. It doesn't breathe fire. It doesn't have wings. It's just a massive, scaly thing. But dragon is fantasy, and that allows people to get hold of it. And if you really love dragons, it is a dragon. Buy the book.
Very good.
Yeah, maybe I should steal that and label my sea monsters as dragons instead.
It's open game. Does anyone else have any stories of conflict between marketing and your artistic impulses?
The weird one, I think, is that kind of genre or non-genre that's young adult, because there is such a big no man's land there, where you can have a book, the identical book could have been marketed as a YA book or not as a YA book, and it's all down to how the publishers want to spin it. Because of course it's a genre that is not really a genre at all, but is treated like one by publishers. So that's the crazy thing. I mean, my Tiger and the Wolf series could have been marketed as young adult. Firewalkers could have been marketed as young adult, purely because of effectively the age of the protagonist, and that it is those teenage characters that are getting the stuff done. But they both come out as adult books, and they've done well. The ones that are out already have done perfectly well for that. It's just the way that's treated in the same way as, oh, well, you have fantasy and you have science fiction, you have horror and you have young adult, and it's that one of these things is not like the others.
Yeah, one of them is about demographics and the other is about theming and structure and such. And so, yeah, that has always struck me as strange as well.
I think it's only.
I was going to say, well, YA is more of a marketing gimmick than it is an actual genre.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating for us authors when we're making something we think goes into one box or would be appreciated by some type of people, and then we're told, no, you gotta label it this way. So. It's
frustrating until you realize that it works. because
Sure.
what I want is as many people to read my books as possible. I'm not fussed about money. That isn't my head. I just want people to read them and meet these characters because it excites me, and I'm excited by that. And once I realized that this title and this cover would do that, and it would work, and people would pick it up because of that. After that, ever since covers, I've just been like, you do what you want. I don't really mind, as long as Orbit are very good. They let me write the story and they don't mess about with that. I'm like, yeah, then do whatever you want, RJ. But and then they do their thing, and so far, touch wood, it's been working. So I don't really feel any tension about being put in a job. Just put me wherever. I don't care.
Great. Let's move on to the topic of, we were kind of touching on it earlier, but blending genres. When we're coming at it as an author, do you consciously think to yourself, I'm blending, murder, mystery, and fantasy, or you're just writing a story about characters and whatever emerges? How does that work for your guys' various processes? Let's start with Adrian.
Okay, well, I plan the crap out of things. So with me, that kind of thing tends to be baked in from a very early point in the project. And so I don't tend to need to think, oh, wait, no, I'm writing, I'm writing epic fantasy here, because it's the direction the book is going already has that inherently in it. I guess the one big difference with that is if I'm doing what I fondly consider to be hard science fiction, because at that point I occasionally have to say, well, all right, I've got to do something different to what I'm planning because the science doesn't support it. But that's a constraint that I feel I need to be faithful to for that particular type of science fiction. So
would you say that because you chose that genre, you're using it as a forcing function to shape the plot, the narrative, the world building?
Yeah, it's well, I mean, it's sort of 90%. It's the challenge I'm setting myself to say, right, I want to write the story about spiders evolving a high-tech civilization, and I want to do it entirely within the bounds of what we think could potentially happen. And it's 10% so that I don't get scientists turning up on Twitter and telling me I've got it wrong.
Very good. Dave, thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, Adrian, it's wonderful to hear that you plan the crap out of stuff, because I do, and I moderated the plotters versus pantsers panel on Friday, and I was hopelessly outnumbered. You know, RJ talking about just making it up as he goes along, and Anna Sparks putting it from an alternate dimension, fully formed. So it's nice to see somebody that plans it. And so I do kind of the similar things. You know, I set out to do epic fantasy. Part of that to me is that, with epic fantasy, I expect multiple different point of view characters. I expect kind of like, long and complex emotional character arcs. And then each of the books in my series has got this kind of theme to it, I guess, that I wanted to tackle. So like I said, the first one, King's Hold, definitely had this political fantasy element, because it's moving from a kingdom to a democracy. And so I wanted to be able to, kind of like build in some elements of the political components there. And the third book that I'm writing right now is more of like what I think of, and I don't know how you would genre classify this, but it's more like your typical quest or journey fantasy, which I think is kind of a mainstay of the genre too. So I think about these kind of elements at the beginning as I'm kind of addressing the plotting and the main questions that I'm going to answer as part of the story. And then I think after that, it just kind of like goes into the background. Like, then it's just kind of, it's working out how to tell the story, is how to, I'm kind of like, everything I'm doing is basically living within this epic framework, I guess.
Okay. Anita, thoughts?
It kind of depends on the book with me. Like, I usually just start out with a general genre, and then things tend to creep in to it. But with a couple of books, like with Fairy Tale Fusion, for instance, it was a deliberate choice to mash up two genres, noir crime and fairy tale fantasy. So the only one that really comes out straight genres are my horror stories, because I just write those to scare the crap out of people. So
very good.
I'm always a bit puzzled, a bit worried when people say, how much do you think about? Because I'm like the antimatter to Adrian and Dave's matter, in that I don't think at all ever. It's as soon as I start thinking about things, I just stop and sit there and think about it. And that's no use, just do it. And so I didn't put any thought into any of that. Sounds wrong. I was about to say I didn't put any thought into any of my books. A lot of thought goes into my books, but it's very much at the moment rather than, I don't do any planning really beforehand, apart from those vague thoughts flying around, and then at some point they crystallize into a thing, and then that's going like Age of Assassins. Though I think of it as a crime book, it obeys that rule that Campbell said about science fiction, that if you take out the science element, does it fall apart? And if it does, you know it's a science fiction book. Or with Age of Assassins, if you take out the magic, the plot falls apart because it is reliant upon that. So it's very much a fantasy book, but partly I didn't really think about it. It just seemed to be the most sensible way of making it. And I wanted to write about massive creatures with antlers, and you can't do that in historic fiction. So that wasn't an option to me. So I was going towards fantasy anyway.
Am I perceiving a divide between people on the pantser end of the spectrum and the plotter end of the spectrum here? Can you give me a raise of hands if you consider yourself more plotter? Okay. Oh, okay. So Anita, and then pantser would obviously, you know.
Oh my God, I'm surrounded.
The architect.
Finally, we win.
Well, what I'm wondering is how, because genre conventions can drive so much of your plot and character development and all of these things, it seems to me that it's inevitable you're going to run into genre concerns if you are plotting things out from the beginning, whereas you'll discover it if you're just going free, running through a field. Okay.
It's a beautiful image of me running through a lovely field.
Yes, I see the prancing.
Yeah.
The hair blowing in the wind.
Yeah. I wish I'd brought in my fan. I could have put it on. I had a full 80s metal video effect.
Very good. Okay, a reminder to the audience that we do take questions. We're going to try to clump them near the end, the last 15 minutes, but you know, depending on how the conversation goes, we can always use those in as we go. Always open to pantsing if it's good pantsing. How are your books perceived by people that you've been surprised? So we're not talking marketing, but you've heard from reviews, or a friend has talked to you about your book and said, I thought this was X and you thought it was Y. And did that bother you?
Well, with my epic fantasy series, Saga of the Outer Islands, one reader said that it reminded him of Sword and Sorcery, which kind of surprised me because there's really no swords in it. I mean, it takes place mostly on a ship, and there's a lot of gods and stuff in it, so maybe that's why. But actually, it is done very well in the Sword and Sorcery that I've marketed it to, so I'm not going to argue with it.
I mentioned my first book is supposed to be this political fantasy, and I get quite often in the reviews saying I was worried this was going to be too political or too dry, and actually it's fun. So that's always kind of like good praise. and then I write books of short stories between each of the major books, and then pretty much every review always starts with, I don't normally like short stories, but I like these ones. So it's like damning with faint praise, I guess is a good thing.
Yeah, I've gotten that one too. Don't usually read short stories, but I love these.
Yeah.
And I think with the subgenres, also you tend to run into the fact that everyone's definition of what precisely a given subgenre includes or doesn't include is different. And so when someone says, "Oh, this book of yours is a space opera," I'll see in a review, and they, well, I don't personally feel, but and it's not being said as a criticism or anything like that. It's all perfectly lovely, but it all basically comes down to the fact that the finer you split all of these little divisions, the less sense it really makes, and the fact that they all overlap and there's a lot of no man's land between them, and that Venn diagram is insanely messy, and where any book fits in it is going to vary depending on who you ask. So I think if someone looked at a fantasy book of mine and said it was science fiction, I'd probably raise an eyebrow. But anything finer than that, there's a lot of wiggle room, I think.
Yeah, and we also
Yeah.
see new micro genres emerging constantly. It's something that has always happened in music, and so it's interesting to see maybe in the past 10, 20 years how the market is diffusing or fragmenting into these micro genres.
Okay, can I take I think the in fantasy the obvious example here is grimdark, because it was a thing and it frequently gets given as a subgenre, but which makes it essentially, I think, more of a distinct thing than it was. What it really is, it's kind of a movement in the same way you get in any kind of literature. There were a few books, they did very well. Some other authors came in and really sort of doubled down on what people seem to like with those, and you end up with people who are kind of like masters of the genre, like of the particular form, like Abercrombie, say, who make it, and suddenly everyone is writing that kind of thing. It's very popular, people love reading it. But I think when you then start, I mean, I've been on God knows how many panels saying, well, what is grimdark? Is grimdark dead? What, is this grimdark? And is that, and you basically, it's like nailing fog to the wall, because it's not really a genre. It's just a series of elements brought together within a wider type of fantasy. And it usually is at least a more personal rather than the grand epic fantasy, but not always. Again, fog to the wall. So as you get finer and finer, and in trying to define your subgenres, all you're really talking about is there is a particular movement, there is a particular school of writing that happened at this particular point in time when there were a number of books that had similar elements. But that's not a good way to market, and therefore things get called genres when I kind of feel that's not the most helpful way of looking at them.
I'm never quite sure how I would nail my books into a genre, which is why I'm very glad I have a publisher who can go and do that, because a book's an intensely personal thing when you write it, and you're very clear on what you're doing with it. But probably about 80% of the time, the reader will get something different out of it to what you thought, and you're like, oh, which is why authors appear clever, because you'll find there are huge amounts of stuff in our book. Because if somebody comes up to you and says, I think it's really clever the way you did this in that book, you just say yes, whether you meant to or not. So it looks like you're really good because you're doing loads and loads of things, and actually, no, that was just this sentence of somebody walking down the street. But I mean, Age of Assassins got called grimdark because it was coming out in the middle of that, but I think it's essentially very hopeful, so it doesn't really fit into what is that genre. And it's not really epic fantasy because it's one point of view and it's first person, so it doesn't quite fit into that multi-point of view thing. So it is what it is. It's epic fantasy. It's dark fantasy is probably the easiest way to find a genre for it to fit. Adrian could probably place it better than I could, because he knows this stuff.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's time for a new model of interpreting genre fiction, because the one we have right now is kind of a branching tree where you kind of have a fantasy branch, and then off of that you've got steampunk, and then off of that you've got, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe thinking of it more in a meta tags way, where you can have a group of photographs, and this photograph has a traffic light in it, and this one has a house in it, and and those tags can be applied to lots of different things. So getting back to grimdark, for example, there's no reason why you couldn't have a grimdark murder mystery and a grimdark science fiction and a grimdark steampunk. All these things, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to mix. And that leads into CM Clark's question, which I'm going to pose to you, asking, what genres do you think should not mix? Is that a thing? Is that a valid question?
The minute somebody said to me, you should never mix two genres, that will become my next project. I just know it. That is exactly how my mind works. Because I always said I was never going to write a book with a teenage protagonist and romance of any type in it, and that is a book with a teenage protagonist and a romance in it. So the minute I say no, then so everything should mix, everything, and you should find joy in anyone that gets upset by it.
I'm willing to bet that name any two genres, and you'd be able to think of an example where they'd been successfully combined.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's tons of genre mix-ups and things that you would never think of that are actually out there and doing well. So yeah, I think there are no genres you can't mix.
Yeah, the only one that seems like difficult at the top of my head is if you were to take lit RPG and try to mix that with something like historical fiction or something. But I guess you could do that too if the game is set in some like the court of Louis XIV or something.
Assassin's Creed, maybe.
Yeah, right. Oh yeah. So there you go. Right. Yeah. So no.
These kind of debates always turn into that. The second you say a thing can't be done, you'll get 100 hands saying nope, right there. The Worlds in Ink asks, doesn't the perception of a specific genre shift with time? And I guess I would add to that, does that impact us as authors when we find ourselves in a genre? Because often there's a long tail to these things, right? Many of us are still greatly influenced by Tolkien, from 70 years ago, and even earlier books than that. A lot of us came of age in the 70s and 80s fantasy or science fiction, which is a very different flavor than what's being produced now. So how does that impact your artistic process?
I mean, my personal theory about the whole grimdark business is that it's a bunch of writers who have mostly come out of playing a lot of role-playing games. It's people of frequently people of my kind of age. And the thing about role-playing games is it completely demolishes your kind of traditional perfect hero, your Tolkienian quest and everything, everyone behaving as heroes are supposed to behave, or when they fall tragically and are punished for it. Because in a role-playing game, everyone tends to act very, very badly. And if you look at the kind of the Abercrombie and the Scott Lynch sort of characters, they act a lot like characters in a role-playing game. And so I think that, and that's absolutely a time thing. It's a generation of writers growing up with that particular background and bouncing off the established tradition to produce something new.
Yeah, I don't think you get much epic fantasy written in the style of David Eddings or like Feist, which is early stuff that I grew up reading kind of in the 80s and 90s. Now it's like, if you think of epic fantasy, you can look at George R.R. Martin and kind of that's a very different beast than kind of what you might think of as the traditional epic from 20, 30 years. Well, I guess more like 30 years ago now. But I agree with the role-playing games. That's a good point, Adrian. I mean, I think if anyone's ever actually DM'd a game before in the past and you try to lead people along this, potentially noble quest, they're liable to go off the rails in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, authors are influenced by whatever their experience and whatever's around them. So fantasy's bound to change over the years and evolve and do all sorts of strange and wonderful things.
It's interesting what Adrian and David said, because if I'd come to it without having heard them talk, I would have thought that the grimdark and realist movement in fantasy was maybe coming from historical fiction into fantasy and then stealing a few of those things. But I think maybe it's a mixture of those two things, because I mean George R. Martin is retelling the War of the Roses, and Joe Abercrombie. There seems to be a lot of what feels like it's kind of Bernard Cornwellish in some of the battles. And I know for me, I'm coming from history. That is my big love, and that is where I'm writing. I'm just, as I said to David when we did our thing, I can't do research because it's too interesting, and I just read about history for 3 months, and then deadlines are on the way, and I cry.
I do wonder if that, because I'm thinking there was never a great deal of regulation as far as I'm aware of fantasy fiction, but what there was regulated, of course, for many decades was comics. You had the comics code, and you have limits to what comics could do. And I do wonder also, if you look at a lot of fiction, it's a book about a world full of horrible people, and some of the horrible people will win, is a thing that maybe if you'd presented that to a publisher in the 70s, you would have been kicked out the door. I don't know. I think that, you know, obviously, you know, we're products of a society, and society has evolved to be more effectively to allow a greater range of elements in its pop culture.
I do wonder if now the world is a bit scarier, and we've had like we're having, the reason for this is a big world level scare. If fantasy is going to do a bit of a turn and go back to that more sort of David Eddings fantasy, like a bit of a hug, and everything's going to be nice, rather than fantasy that is kind of the real world and it is up in your face and going, look, bad things happen to good people. And that, I'm not quite sure where that thought's going, but it's definitely going somewhere. Yeah.
Well, in the 70s, 80s, didn't you still have like the whole Cold War dynamic too? I mean, it was very much kind of like the West versus this big thing, impending cataclysm through nuclear conflict at any particular moment in time. And then obviously we've moved past that now, and now world still seems as scary, but it's like it's a whole different kind of like myriad of different types of scariness. That's not necessarily
we've lost our big bad in a lot of ways. We had a big bad, we had a big bad guy, and then it's gone. And I think we're seeing a lot of that confusion done through fiction now. So I don't have bad guys in my books. The bad guys is generally society, and the people who we're following are people trying to change that, which is kind of and not a standard fantasy thing. You often have the bad guy who you have to overcome, which I don't really like that.
It feels like culturally when a big bad emerges on the world stage, that is when that kind of black and white heroic fantasy will thrive. You know, 9/11 was right when Lord of the Rings had its huge resurgence. You know, obviously the movies helped that quite a bit, but it did kind of it, you know, as you described it, a hug. And as always, just like I pointed out earlier, you bring up a proposed rule, and someone's up here right now to contradict it. James Latimer says Elric isn't black and white, so there's been some outliers.
James.
I mean, Elric is quite explicitly bouncing back off the Tolkien tradition. Moorcock had a lot of fairly harsh things to say about Tolkien, and of course, pre-Tolkien, you've got the pulp fantasy when things are a lot much grayer. So I mean, really, we're not kind of going off in directions never before tested. We're going back to places that the genre had been avoiding for a little while.
Conan was not a chummy bloke.
No.
Indeed. Another thing that occurs to me is that as a generation is raised on something that is perceived in the culture to be pulp or for a sub-segment of society, it's often interpreted in a more literal adult way, you know, as the people who were raised on it, and, you know, as children, they interpret it. So we had the pulpy superheroes, and then in the late 90s and early 2000s up till today, we have these very literal, you know, adultish interpretations of these characters and themes. And I wonder if that might be playing into it as well. You know, you had people raised on the Conan, and then they made, you know, Lord of the Rings, and then Lord of the Rings is as serious as you can get as far as like, hey, let's take this completely literally and make a real world where this is all plausible. It's not just, you know, random stuff going on like so much fantasy of the past, you know, like Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland. But yeah, I think we go through those waves, and they do affect the way that genre is interpreted, both by the culture at large and we as artists. So, and sorry, I'm moderator. I should be asking questions, not going on rants like that. Let's go to a question. CM Clark also asked, can genre fantasy be fantasy without magic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I mean, and one of the things, it's not done very often, but secondary worlds without magic are certainly out there. I mean, the two that I particularly enjoy are Gormenghast. Is a very gothic world, but there's no explicit magic in it. But at the same time, it is absolutely a fantasy world. But also Francis Harding's Fly By Night is a beautiful kind of echo history fantasy world. Absolutely no magic of any kind, but it is one of the most interesting and immersive worlds I've read. It's really beautifully put together.
Any other thoughts, or is it just a flat yes?
Sorry
I
to
think
monopolize that one.
I think if you have magic, it has to be part of that world. So in that world, it wouldn't really be seen as magic the way we talk about it. I quite like that idea. That when I say I think that you have to, I'm talking deliberately about me, even though I don't actually do that. But I think it would be an interesting idea to make it much more mundane. I know there are writers that do that, but so you can, the same, it works with worlds without magic. It is still fantastical to us the way this world is. That it's, especially, I'm very interested in the idea of the flora and fauna, which is a bunch, it's full of that, of different creatures, and the way that works, and how we make something believable that maybe isn't human in the same way we are. And I think that's quite an interesting idea to go with. That means you don't need magic to get that sort of wow or that sense of wonder thing, which I know is a science fiction idea, but I like that sense of wonder, that kind of wow moment in a book.
Yeah, I was going to springboard off of that and say, if genre acts as a kind of promise to a reader, and your story is being promised a particular flavor, if one of the pillars of that genre is not in your book, does that then give you more responsibility to build up the other pillars, to as you were saying, more flora and fauna, to get that sense of awe and wonder of a different world? Is that something you guys ever think about, of purposely removing a pillar of a genre and building up the other one stronger?
No.
No. Well, what you say, Josh, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you were going to write a
Rather than
fantasy
done.
book without magic, you probably would just naturally build up whatever fantastical elements you're using, just to create the world building itself.
I expect somebody done it, but oh, sorry, Anita.
I was going to say, but you probably wouldn't do it consciously. It would just flow out of the story.
Yeah. I'd quite like to see someone who's done the sort of 5 pillars of fantasy, kind of, so you can see these are the things that make a fantasy book, and then you can think, right, I'm taking that one away. Let's see what we can do with that one, because that's how I generate worlds, is by taking something I know and then removing things, so I have to work around it and find a different world, if that makes sense.
I think
quite interesting.
Oh, sorry, I was going to, that point that you just said there. The thing that I read some talk that Terry Pratchett did ages ago, and he said, kind of one of the best things to do with fantasy is to kind of, imagine our world and then take away one thing that just makes it slightly different, and then see kind of like where that takes you. So, with the pillars would be good. That's like a PhD paper for somebody.
I assume in Pratchett's case, it was curvature.
Right. Yes, that's right. Yes. I think he took.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, I think Pratchett took away more than one thing in the end. I think he was being kind of honest about it.
Yeah, when you do that, whether it's a genre convention or something in your world building, it's like pulling a thread, and if you just keep following the ramifications of it, you'll find very interesting, nuanced ways to differentiate your work from others, which I'm a big fan of that. Okay, gonna throw out to the audience again. Hey, we are always open to questions. The last question I had from our little preface emails that we were sending back and forth, and we've touched on this a lot, but maybe this particular formulation will spark different kind of conversation. Do genre labels really work within the context of wide versus narrow? So you can say my genre is fantasy, or you can say it's urban portal steampunk fantasy, etc. Do they work? I guess is there an approach we haven't taken to talking about this yet, whether it's from an artistic perspective, marketing, customer expectations, etc.
Fantasy as a genre, I've found, is really good if a taxi driver wants to talk to you about writing books, and they say, what sort of books do you write? And you say fantasy, they'll go, oh. And they don't want to talk to you anymore. That's quite. It's not as exciting. It's really weird. It doesn't have this kind of genre kudos that maybe other genres do. yeah, well, kind of science fiction, that's a bit sexier to some people, even though you think like Game of Thrones is massive. And then someone says, oh, I'm a fantasy writer, and they go, oh, yeah, and they say, like Game of Thrones, then they go, oh. And that's kind of, it's really weird how people think of a thing, and you can see there's a kind of, oh, and then, yeah, actually, I know that thing and I like it. So it's quite, I'm not quite sure that was a question you asked, but it was what I said in the end.
No, it's good. That makes me think about the usefulness of buckets. When buckets get large enough, they seem like they're, when you have Alice in Wonderland next to Game of Thrones, is that still a useful bucket?
Not
I love that bucket.
Really? I think it's kind of pointless. I mean, it's like what you were saying before, Josh, like with the tags. I mean, it would be almost cool if there was a bingo card and you could select the things on the bingo card that actually are relevant to your book, and like that was, and then you just combine them into one word. Yeah,
Angry Robot used to market their books like a series of tags on the back.
Yeah.
Sort of file under, and then these things. So it's this. I guess this is where things like the people who liked this book have also looked at.
Yeah, the algorithms that happen under the hood on Netflix and Amazon and stuff like that. That's utilizing that same kind of idea.
I once saw in a similar way. I once saw someone very angry about the idea of content warning tags on books, which and they were dead set against it and saying how terrible this idea was, and it was stifling artistic freedom. And I just thought, have you never been a 13-year-old buying a CD? Because I would love an adult content warning on the front of my book. I think loads more people would buy them if you did that. But yeah, I'm quite up for the idea of tags. I think that's a good idea.
Interesting.
What would be the favorite tags that people could have? I mean, one of the things that annoys me sometimes is when people make up swear words like that are too close to real swear words. I just think, just swear, just say fuck as opposed to fun. So
it's really hard to get an authentic sounding but entirely fabricated piece of slang is insanely difficult.
It is cracking hard.
Right.
I've problem putting swear words in my books because in my head that they're just really culturally specific things. Like in the bone ships, there's no hang-ups about sex in a society. It's not a problem, you can do that. And once you have that, then fuck, it's a swear word, just stops making sense because it's not a taboo anymore. So it's not a thing you can use as I mean, you can, of course you can, because it works on us, which is what you're writing for the audience. But in the kind of minutiae writer brain that's going on when you're writing it and you're thinking, well, no, I can't do that. That didn't work. But that's one that everyone here must do, that thing where you're taking out tiny little things that nobody will ever notice, but they're kind of in your head. They're really important.
It's using the word fire for shooting a bow. Which is a relative. It's a gun. It's a gunpowder thing, and if you have a culture that doesn't have gunpowder weapons, you won't be saying fire to your troops. You'd be saying loose or something like that, which is something I cross fingers. I kept to all the way through 10 volumes of Shadows of the Abt. But
my editor keeps me straight on that one.
At the same time, you've got to think these people are from another world. They're not speaking English. We are. If what we're getting is presumably a translation from whatever, it's therefore modern words are going to creep in there.
It's weird how hardwired you are to do stuff, because in this the ships, they have sails, but they didn't call them sails. They call them wings because they only know birds. They don't have anything, so that makes sense to them. But it is very, very hard not to use the word sailor. It's
Right.
almost impossible. And even the copy editors and my editor have taken stuff out and just put the word sailor in because they wanted a different word for a crew member. But and then you kind of, as a group, I think we managed to excise them all from the book. And if we haven't, don't tell me. I don't want to know. So just keep it to yourself. It's okay. I'll just sit there and cry. So I need too much work.
Anita, I wanted to ask you, because you're the one who's a bit of an outlier. You said at the beginning that you make horror, qua horror. You didn't use those exact words, but you're saying you're very comfortable in that genre, saying this is just straightforward horror. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you, and how are you purposely avoiding, combining it with other genres?
Well, I do combine it with other genres, like this book that I showed. That's horror fantasy. I mean, all the stories in there are fantasy stories, but they are very dark, and a lot of people die. So yeah, I mean, so it could easily be classed as horror as well, or the darker fantasy. I mean, it's not quite grimdark, even though grimdark is not a genre apparently. But yeah, so and a lot of like my epic fantasy, it is epic fantasy, but the last two books in the trilogy have horror elements in it. I mean, so yeah, I do combine it, but when I do write my straight horror, it's basically killers, demons, a lot of blood, a lot of people dying, a lot of scares, basic horror tropes on it. And a lot of that, my horror stuff is my short stories, my flash fiction. So, but because that's, when I say it's straight up, I mean, there's nothing, I mean, I'm going for the fear factor when I write the horror stories, right? Because that's the one thing, the one element, the expectation that horror readers want is the fear. They want to be scared. They want to have something come and say, well, they're going to think about it 3 hours later and jump because something reminded them of the story.
And would you say that it's more difficult to craft stories that accomplish that when, well, obviously you have your fantasy ones, but say a sci-fi horror or a steampunk horror, et cetera, when the more you're blending other flavors in, is that watering it down, making it more difficult to be scary?
Actually, I have to watch the opposite. I have to make sure I don't overpower the steampunk or overpower the fantasy with the horror, because it's a lot easier for me to write the horror, and it's a lot more enjoyable, which may sound really bad, but it is a lot more enjoyable to write the horror, because with horror, you can go to all sorts of extremes that you can't necessarily do with other genres. And I mean, sometimes you have to dial it back, but the horror readers like the extremes. So you can go pretty dark with horror. So when I'm combining it with other genres, I always have to dial it back. And that's what I'm wondering about the third book in my trilogy. Did I dial it back enough with some of the scenes with the pirates? But yeah.
I'm loving your skulls and ships, Anita. I feel we are kindred spirits.
Yeah. There's actually walking skeletons in book 2 of my Saga the Outer Islands trilogy.
Oh, can't get enough of those.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of
Harryhausen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So I put a little homage in the second book to the walking skeletons.
That's actually that brings up an interesting question to me, because walking skeletons are such a trope that we're so visually defined by stop motion Harryhausen, in film. Do you find that maybe works against the scariness factor, or is that a concern of yours?
Well, my skeletons were tied to a sort of Lovecraftian monster. Mm-hmm. And basically they were poor drowned sailors that got resurrected. So I don't think the scare factor has been watered down with that. Because I mean, basically you can't kill them and they will keep coming.
Yeah. Let's jump to some audience questions. We've got James Latimer saying, I feel like a lot of things get labeled epic fantasy that I wouldn't have thought of that way. What does it mean to you? Yeah, so this gets back to our conversation of, the genres evolve. As people in the year of our Lord 2020, let's hear what you guys think epic fantasy means these days.
Well,
I don't know.
Okay, to me, and I'm quite prepared to be sort of entirely wrong on this, but to me it is a scale thing. Epic fantasy is it requires sort of your big map and your big journeys and your big wars and your big cast of characters. and multiple locations and multiple points of view, and that's the epicness. So Game of Thrones is epic, and the Malazan books are epic. And it's that kind of grand scale where the things at stake are nations and empires and worlds, as opposed to a story that focuses on a small group of characters who are much more immersed in their own personal sort of aims and goals and priorities, rather than working towards a bigger thing. But like, yeah, as with every distinction, there is a colossal no man's land where these things just kind of blend together. But so with RJ's Age of Assassins, which is, I will say, an absolutely phenomenal book and the start of a phenomenal series, I wouldn't personally have said it was epic fantasy because of the tight focus on the characters involved. Which
Character focused fantasy is
yeah, because I mean, if you look at heroic fantasy, which is kind of the level below that, and which is where I would have put that book, is where the focus is much more on the characters than on the bigger picture. But that's just me.
Yeah,
I think a pretty
distinction, I think, between the personal character arc versus the world arc. You know, those two, the interplay between them, and there's, yeah, as you said, a large gradient between them. Sorry, I interrupted you, RJ.
I'd agree with Adrian really, because he knows his stuff. But I was going to say I was wondering what David, because he's an epic, but that's how he describes what he does as epic fantasy.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, I generally agree with Adrian too. Like, epic's got to be kind of like this broader thing with big stakes going across multiple different locations. But I think character's still got to be part of it. Character's got to be kind of like a massive component for you to care about what's happening. You know, I love the Malazan series. You know, they were awesome, kind of in their epicness. I think I mentioned on Friday that's like, you felt like Erickson wanted to write the most epic thing ever, and so he did all this extra stuff. But you kind of lose the characters at points, certain points in between, because like it shifts all over the place. So as I've tried to write epic fantasy, I've tried to keep it very character focused, and it's almost like, you know, a group of people who started in different places coming together, trying to do something that's good, and for the betterment of more people. But it's a struggle for them. So it's more about like their struggles within a system that is set against them. So so now you made me think, yeah, Adrian, that I'm not writing epic fantasy at all, and I'm writing something else.
Well, it's also true. I think a single series can have some parts of it that kind of seem naturally to fall into that epic fantasy setting, and some parts that don't. I mean, Elric was mentioned, and a lot of Elric is not what I would have said was epic fantasy, but at the end of it, he goes and has a battle, an enormous battle that basically unmakes the entire universe or multiverse or whatever terminology.
He's a bit of a one, though, isn't he, Elric? He's up to stuff like that.
Yeah, but through a lot of it, he's doing very much almost like the more Conan stuff. He's wandering about, killing the odd monster and just getting into very small level scraps. So it's not even a genre distinction that necessarily holds true within a particular set of books.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so we're going to start wrapping up. I want to get to one more question. We've kind of touched on it a bit, but Regina Wilson asks, how important do you think POV is to genre? RJ, and then since then Adrian, have both mentioned multiple POVs as a hallmark of epic fantasy. Most YA is first person. How closely are these tied together? You guys have any strong thoughts on those things as we wrap up?
We write what we want to. I struggle with multiple POV fantasy because there's always trying to say this really quickly. I always find there's one character I really like, and then other ones I'm not as interested in. So I'll be reading about Josh, which is brilliant, and I love reading about Josh. And then I get on to Adrian, and I'm like, oh God, not Adrian again. When I'm reading epic fantasy, and then when I got to the third Game of Thrones book, I was so annoyed by it. I did post-it notes through the book so I could read each character. As a book on its own. It doesn't work. Don't do it. I've saved you that bother.
I think anything goes, whether it's multiple or first. I hate second person personally. Like I don't see how it works. And I've got this. First person is still sometimes even a struggle for me too. Just second person, and then present tense is always kind of an issue for me too. But
All right. Well, we are at less than a minute, so we'll just go ahead and wrap it from here. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a very stimulating conversation. Comments are all loving it, so this was great. Everyone who is watching from the future, there is a whole suite of these videos available on the QuaranCon the YouTube channel. So please subscribe, smash that like button, all those cool things you can do on the internet. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. And we'll go ahead and wrap from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I literally don't know how to stop this. So this is going to be a really wonderfully awkward ending.
We should just carry on.
Are we done?
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, we're done. This is the outtakes. We're in the outtakes.